Well, last week we saw that the tragedy that had befallen Naomi and Ruth and the death of their husbands. And so they made their way from the land of Moab back to Naomi's home in Bethlehem. They had to really start life over. It was a difficult situation. And so Ruth chapter 1 ends telling us that they had arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, which is where chapter 2 will begin. However, the second chapter of Ruth gives us a very unique opportunity to see God's welfare system in action during the time of the judges, how things were working. The Israelites were commanded by God's law to be merciful to the poor, to the resident alien, to the orphan, and to the widow. There were provisions in the law for how this was to be done. And there were these were the people who were at most at risk in society and would often have to live, just day by day trying to survive. Maybe in our society we might call it living paycheck to paycheck, but in their world, it was one day to the next trying to survive. And so one of the things God did to help provide for these disadvantaged people was give special instruction for how property owners were to go about harvesting their crops. And that's going to come to be important to us as we look at Ruth chapter 2. So let's start in Leviticus. I know it's your favorite book, right? Leviticus? Okay, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22. God says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap all the way to the edge of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the resident alien. I am the Lord your God." In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19, we read this. It says, "When you reap the harvest in your field and you forget the sheaf in the field, do not go back and get it. It is to be left for the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you knock down the fruit from your olive tree, do not go over the branches again. What remains will be for the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. What remains will be for the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this." So God's command was that when they harvested from their fields, they were not to harvest everything, but to deliberately leave the outer edges of the property unharvested. And the reason for that was so that the poor could come and harvest it for themselves. Furthermore, when they were harvesting, if they accidentally dropped some sheaves of grain or left something behind, they were not to go back and pick it up. But instead, they were to leave what they dropped for the poor, so they could come and pick it up on their part. Anything they missed or dropped was to be left for the poor. They were to do this sort of thing in their vineyards and orchards. In that case, they were allowed to go over the trees once, pick whatever they did the first time. But if they missed any fruit, that was to be left for the poor that could come and harvest it themselves. This is how God instructed Israel to provide welfare for the poor, by allowing them some of the harvest of the land. Now, this concept is probably difficult for our society, because we see the land as private property. We might say, "What do you mean people can come onto my property and help themselves to the fruit and grain that I left behind? It's my property." Right? Isn't that what we would say? Or what our society would say? However, God's law did not accept our concept of private property. Not just for welfare, but for anyone who was hungry. God allowed you to eat directly from your neighbor's field or vineyard or orchard if you happen to be hungry while passing through. This is Deuteronomy chapter 23, beginning of verse 24. "When you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat as many grapes as you want until you are full, but do not put any in your container. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck heads of grain with your hand, but do not put the sickle to your neighbor's grain." So if you were hungry and you were passing through your neighbor's field, you could start eating whatever was there. But you were only allowed to eat what you could pick with your hand and what you were actually eating at that moment. You were not allowed to harvest extra and take it with you for later. This is what we see Jesus' disciples doing. This is in Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. It says, "At that time, Jesus passed through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick and eat some of the heads of grain. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'See, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.' He said to them, 'Haven't you read what David did when he and those with him were hungry, how he entered the house of God, and they ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him to eat, or for those with him to eat, but only for the priests? Or haven't you read in the law that the Sabbath days the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath and are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what this means, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So the Pharisees saw Jesus' disciples eating on the Sabbath. They were walking through a grain field. They were taking some grain and eating it as they went. And they were harvesting, in a manner of speaking, just the part that they were eating. And so they criticized them. But you'll notice they did not criticize them for stealing, because it was not stealing. It was what God allowed. What they criticized them for was breaking the Sabbath. You're picking those heads of grains on the Sabbath. You know, if they were hungry and walking through that field the other 6 days of the week, what they were doing was just fine. Their problem was it was Saturday, and you're not supposed to harvest on Saturday. That's what they complained about. And Jesus corrected their understanding, but again, you'll notice he focused on what was lawful to eat, not on stealing, because in God's book, they weren't stealing. According to God's standards, they had a right to eat from that field, even though it was someone else's field or someone else's tree. And here is, I think, the cultural rub for our society. To us, harvesting food off someone else's property is stealing. That's the way our laws would read. But under God's law, it was not. So which do you think's right, God or our society? There's an interesting question now, isn't it? See, to many that question may seem alarming, but what I find is that, and the shocking reality you'll eventually face if you're trying to follow God's rules for living, is that every society, including our own, has been fundamentally corrupted by sin. Every society has concepts that go against what God said. Now, you can travel the world over. I don't care where you go, you will find in every society something that goes against what God said. Because we're all sinful. No matter what society mankind builds, no matter what rules we come up with, it will not be righteous by God's standard. And just because something is accepted as normal or even morally correct in our society does not mean it's accepted as morally correct by God. They can make a law and say, this is fine. God may say, no, it's not. Okay, we've seen that in our society, haven't we? Just because we accept it as right doesn't mean God does, and vice versa. There may be things we say are wrong, and God says, no, it's not. Whose standard is right? It's a question we should sometimes ponder. And by the way, societies do have collective sin. Okay, sin is not just individual, but a society at its core can be sinful because it's structured in a manner that's not consistent with God's word. And I would dare to say you will find that in every country, in every society, in every people group, in every language. We will not have a truly righteous society until Jesus comes back and reigns over the earth. That's when our hope is. Our hope is not that we're going to elect a great president and it's suddenly going to make everything right. I don't mean to disappoint anyone, but November of next year will not fix all of our problems. Okay? It will not. A new Congress will not fix all of our problems. We will still have sinners running the country, just like we have now. And until Jesus comes back, until Jesus reigns over the earth, until he makes things right, we will not have perfection. There will always be something that's not quite there. That's not quite what it should be. So with that in mind, we can see that God's welfare system was that the property owner was required to leave some food for the poor and the hungry. Furthermore, if a poor person wanted food, they had to go out and work gathering it. There's a different concept. See, this also fits another biblical principle. This is 2 Thessalonians 3:10. It says, in fact, when we were with you, the Apostle Paul writing, when we were with you, this is what we commanded you. If anyone isn't willing to work, he should not eat. Now, I fear our society's system of welfare sometimes rewards people for not working and removes us from the personal responsibility of directly helping our neighbors, our community. It also makes it so that the poor in our society, the poor have to come to the government for help, creating loyalty and dependence, rather than God for help and his people for help. See, God told his people to follow this welfare system because he was the Lord their God and because he had delivered them from Egypt. This welfare system that God established for the people of Israel was directly connected to God's identity and God's redeeming work. Now, that's not to say that God's people didn't give to the poor outside of their welfare system. Indeed, they did, and God expected that they would help the poor, help the widow, help the orphan. But God's designated system for doing this, for this welfare, providing food to the poor, to the resident alien, to the orphan, to the widow, was for them to go and gather it themselves from the property, what the property owners had left. So with all that in mind, let's see how God's system worked in a practical reality, in a real-life person living during the time of Judges. And we get to see that in Ruth chapter 2. Let's pick up in verse 1 of Ruth chapter 2. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. He was a prominent man of the noble character from Elimelech's family. His name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabitess asked Naomi, will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor? Naomi answered, go ahead, my daughter. So Ruth left and entered the field to gather grain behind the harvesters. She happened to be in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. So Ruth and Naomi, they arrived in Bethlehem. We saw that at the end of chapter 1, right there at the beginning of the barley harvest. And they were both widows with no one to support them. They had no children. They had no husbands. So according to God's law, they were the people who are supposed to benefit from God's welfare system. That's who God said. This is who you're leaving it for, the widow, the orphan, the resident alien. Ruth actually applies to, in theory, all of those. So Ruth asked Naomi if she can go behind the harvesters, that is to gather anything that they drop after they've harvested. And Naomi agrees that this is what she should do. Now, my suspicion is they've already discussed this. I mean, they had a long walk from Moab back there, and I don't know if you've ever been around two little widows, they might discuss, what are we going to eat? How are we going to survive? How are we, Well, Naomi has said this is how it works in Israel. This is God's law. And so they get there, and we find Ruth saying, should I do this? And I think what Ruth is really saying is it now time for me to go out and gather behind the harvesters? Is that what I should do? And Naomi says, yes, you should go do this welfare harvesting. What is the divine act of providence that we see in this passage? The part of the story is that she happens to be harvesting in the field of Boaz. Boaz just happens to be a relative of Elimelech's family. Now, we're not told the exact relationship between Elimelech and Boaz, just that they are somehow related. So Ruth is reaping in Boaz's field, and it appears to be by chance But as the story unfolds, what it comes clear is this was God's plan. God is working in this situation. He is providing, even though it is through the system of the law, He is providing and putting them there. And when we step out in faith, when you do the right thing, God often causes it to line up for His plan to be accomplished in your life. Okay? You'll never go wrong with God doing the right thing. Do the right thing, trust Him for the outcome. And that's what we see here with Ruth. And so Ruth chapter 2, verse 4, she's out there harvesting behind the harvester. She's going along, picking up, gleaning what they drop behind. It says, verse 4, it says, later when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they replied. For those of us who are not used to farm life, it's probably worth mentioning that they don't usually keep the fields in the middle of town. Okay, you got to get out of town to get to the fields where they have it. All the land surrounding the town, this was kind of how the cities and towns in Israel were set up. They would have a town where the people lived, and the land surrounding the town would be their fields for growing food and for their cattle to graze. And so they would have designated areas for that surrounding the town, but the people would usually live in the town, which is where you'd find your craftsmen and your markets and, that type of thing in the town. And so Ruth had gone out of Bethlehem, where she and Naomi were living, to the fields where they were being harvested. Boaz was a wealthy landowner, so his servants or his employees were out harvesting the grain. He then later comes along to check on their progress. Okay, Boaz is the owner of the land. He's not the guy who's out there working himself so much as he's supervising. And so the statements that are made here, "The Lord be with you" and "The Lord bless you," kind of their statements back and forth to each other, seem to be standard greetings in their culture. Much, as we might say, good morning or goodbye. And although it's not known by most people, when we say goodbye, we're actually using a shortened expression from Old English that would have originally been something to the effect of "God be with you." God be ye, God goodbye. Spell out the words. But if you go back far enough in Old English, we would be blessed. I love it when an atheist says goodbye. It's kind of fun, as what they're really saying. But that would be their standard expression, "The Lord be with you." And so Boaz gets out to check on the progress, and once he's there, he finds Ruth gleaning in his field. And so let's continue in verse 5. It says, Boaz asked his servant, who was in charge of the harvesters, "Whose young woman is this?" The servant answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab. She asked, 'Will you let me gather fallen grain among the bundles behind the harvesters?' She came and has been on her feet since early morning, except that she rested a little in the shelter." So Boaz gets out there and he notices this foreigner gleaning in his field. He knew it wasn't one of his servants. It's not one of the people who work for him. And so he asked the foreman of his harvesting crew, "Who is this?" And the description given of Ruth here tells us, I think, a fair amount about her. First, she asked permission. Naomi, I'm assuming, has told her God's law. Naomi has already sent her out to do this. She'd asked Naomi, but she asked them permission. And apparently the supervisor of the harvest allows it. This is okay. Yeah, sure, go right ahead. And this asking permission, I think, shows a respectfulness on Ruth's part, but it also tells us the harvester's response shows that they're following God's law. They're following God's law. This is what God said is allowed. The second thing I think that we see in Ruth here in this description is that Ruth is a hard worker. He makes a point of saying she's been on her feet all day other than just a little rest in the shelter. Because they would set up little shelters where they could get shade from the sun. But she's been working all day, only taking one break. So Ruth had worked gathering any grain that the workers had left behind, anything that was on the ground after they had gone through and harvested, anything they missed or accidentally dropped. This is how God's welfare system worked. Now, up to this point, there doesn't seem to be anything special in the treatment of Ruth as a relative. She's getting what God designated. This is what the foreign resident is supposed to get. This is what the widow is supposed to get. And so this is what she's doing. But it's about to change. Look at verse 8 of chapter 2 in Ruth. It says, Then Boaz said to Ruth, Listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants. See which field they are harvesting, and follow them. Haven't I ordered my young men not to touch you? When you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled. My guess is that Boaz was the kind of guy who obeyed God's law. He seems an upright kind of guy. So he probably would have allowed any needy person to go behind his harvesters. He would have done what God commanded to pick up what was left behind. But here we see Boaz going beyond what God required. Boaz speaks directly to Ruth after finding out who she was and basically offers her his protection. She's getting his protection. Now, in our culture, we might say he was being a gentleman. Okay, he's being proper. He's doing the right thing. But in his culture, there may have been some family honor involved because he knew who Naomi was. And now that he's found out this is the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi, there may be some family honor involved. But there may also be some level of Middle Eastern hospitality. They would extend protection to people on their property under their care. But the closest reading would indicate that this actually came into three parts. First, Boaz invites Ruth to keep gleaning in his fields with his workers throughout the harvest. Okay, now God's law says, the widow, the orphan, the poor, they could go glean from any field that had stuff left behind. But Boaz says, stay in my fields. Take from my fields. This really is an offer of extended benevolence directly to her and Naomi. You can harvest with my workers in all my fields to make sure you get what you need. That's a very generous offer on Boaz's part. The second part was the protection, because Boaz orders his young men not to touch Ruth. That's what he tells her. I've told my young men not to touch you. He also seems to be indicating that she would be safe under his protection as long as she was harvesting in his fields with his servants. There was a protection for her. Now we know from the book of Judges, which is the time period this is happening, that there were lots of wicked people during that time period. Some pretty, awful things were happening as you read through the book of Judges. So especially with Ruth being a foreigner, it may not have been safe for her walking around by herself, harvesting out in the fields away from town. This puts her in a vulnerable situation. She's alone. And so Boaz is offering his protection. The third part of Boaz's kindness is shown in the offer of water. The offer of water. Now, here in Arizona, we should get this, right? I mean, you never turn anybody away for water. Well, he tells Ruth to drink from the jars that his men were providing for the workers. Drink from our water. Now, Boaz, I think, as a boss, seems to be providing the water for his people. He's got workers out in the field. He's got other servants who are bringing them water. Very reasonable concept, but he's taking care of his servants. But this would mean for Ruth that he's treating her as well as he does his own servants, even though she's not one of his servants. But it would also mean that she does not have to take the time or the potential safety risk of going to draw water herself. His staff is providing it. Boaz is taking care of it. Now, why would Boaz do all this? I'm so glad you asked that question. Because it's the same question Ruth asks. That's the question Ruth asks. Look at the very next verse. Verse 10, she fell face down, bowed to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor with you, so that you notice me, although I am a foreigner?" Boaz answered her, "Everything you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land, and how you came to a people you didn't previously know. May the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. My Lord, she said, I have found favor with you, for you have comforted and encouraged your servant, although I am not like one of your female servants. So we find here Ruth's response is one of humility, but also one of asking the question, why? Why would you show me this special treatment? Okay, any foreigner was supposed to be allowed to go behind and glean, but Boaz was not obligated to offer protection to any foreigner, to share his water with any foreigner, to say, go to all my fields to any foreigner. He's giving her that special treatment. And Boaz's answer was, it's because of everything she's done for Naomi. You know, it's been reported to him. Of course, now it's a small town. It doesn't take long for word to get around small town. I mean, everybody knows everything. But faithfulness, like what Ruth has displayed, is a rare commodity. And Boaz seems to be a faithful kind of guy, right? He's an upright, upstanding kind of guy. That's what we seem to see here in this book. And so being a faithful man himself, he seems to truly value Ruth's character. He values her faithful behavior, her caring for her mother-in-law. Ruth's done the right thing, and now Boaz wants to bless her. He says, this is a good person, I'm going to help. And so he was impressed with Ruth, who had left her native land, who had left her relatives to show kindness to her mother-in-law. And because of this, he showed kindness, support, and gave her his protection. Now, sometimes you do the right thing, God takes care of you. Okay, just keep that note. You see this in Ruth. But he also hoped that God would bless her, that God would bless her for her faithfulness, since she had come to Israel and was taking refuge under God's protection. So Ruth was extremely grateful for this kindness because it had provided her with comfort in what was probably a very anxious situation. How would you feel if you were a foreign person, you didn't know anyone, and you were out there saying, okay, I heard this is how it's supposed to work in your country. You know, I'm supposed to go here and glean this harvest. Wouldn't you be a little anxious? Well, that's where Ruth was. And she found that Boaz had given her great comfort. And she probably had no idea how she would be treated. But she found comfort, and Boaz was there for her. Now, this continues on in verse 14. It says, at mealtime, Boaz told her, come over here and have some bread and dip it in the vinegar sauce. So she sat beside the harvesters, and he offered her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left over. So when lunchtime came, Boaz invites her to come and eat with his work crew. My guess is Boaz provided lunch for his crew just like he did water. That seems to be what we're seeing here. So he shared it with Ruth. And Boaz does seem to be kind of like, he was probably a decent guy to work for. Okay, I don't know if you have all had bosses that were good bosses and bosses that were bad bosses. Okay, well, Boaz seems to be a fair-minded kind of person. He provides for his work crew. He's taking care of things. Now, in Ruth's case, this is a direct compassion towards her. He's inviting her to lunch when he has no obligation to. I mean, she would have been hungry after working all morning. She probably didn't have the resources to pack a lunch. I mean, she and Naomi probably got there with just the clothes on their back. They haven't had any chance to get food. You know, the line at Chick-fil-A would have been too long. It would have taken too much time. I mean, you know, so she's there, and he invites her to lunch. This is a great compassion that he is showing her so that she will not go hungry. What was served was not a feast, but not every meal has to be. We kind of are spoiled in our American diet, right? We have to watch calories. In some parts of the world, you don't have to watch calories, okay, because there isn't enough food. And so she, you know, has that. And sometimes what you need is just enough to sustain you so you can get back to work. In the Middle East, what we find is that bread is often, or was often, the main dish at their meals. You see bread served frequently at their meals. Now, it may have had toppings to put on it or sauces to dip it in. He specifically tells Ruth, dip it in the vinegar sauce. That's what you want for lunch, right? Bread and vinegar? That's a good lunch. But that's what he says. And so he's offered that, and she's offered to eat some roasted grain. And so grain in its many forms were their primary food. Ruth not only eats part of what she's given, and she saves the rest for later which we'll see later in the story, a little bit of a spoiler alert, we'll see she saves it for Naomi. She saves part of her lunch for Naomi. Well, they probably don't have any food in the house yet. Continuing in verse 15, it says, when she got up to gather grain, Boaz ordered his young men, let her even gather grain among the bundles, and don't humiliate her. Pull out some stalks from the bundles for her, and leave them for her to gather. Don't rebuke her. God's welfare system allowed Ruth to gather grain from the edges of the property, to gather, whatever grain, fell on the ground. And by the way, the edges of the property is usually the low quality grain. I don't know if any of you have grown wheat, corn, any kind of grain. Usually if you have like a cornfield, you can see this here in Arizona. You drive by a cornfield, the corn gets taller as it gets into the property. This is to do with how it pollinates. And the corn by the edges tend to get the worst water, tend to take the worst beating from the weather, and get the worst pollination. And so it would work the same with wheat or barley or any of the others. So the edges of the property would have been the lower quality grain to begin with. And that's what God says, you have to leave that for the poor. Or they get to pick up whatever the harvesters drop. She's not legally allowed to go into the inner parts of the field and harvest in front of the workers. That would be stealing. And she's not allowed to go to the bundles and take what they've already harvested. That would have been considered stealing. But Boaz instructs his men otherwise. He says, don't embarrass her. Even if she harvests from the bundles you've already collected, let her have it. Let her take whatever she wants. Furthermore, he instructs them to deliberately pull out some of the grain and throw it on the ground so that she can find it. And he does not want them in any way to shame her or rebuke her for taking it. Now, they're his employees, so probably their job is to guard his wealth. It's his stuff. But he's saying, no, I want her to have this. In this, Boaz is going beyond the welfare system that God required him to follow. He's giving more than he is required to give, so that he could ensure that Ruth and Naomi have enough food. He's making sure they have the food. And so what we see here is Boaz taking the responsibility to directly provide for these widows, but he's doing so in a way that would not bring shame or hurt anyone's feelings. Now, maybe you've run into this with people. Sometimes people, it's hard to give them, they may be hungry, but they won't take charity. Have you ever run into people like that? They're not going to take. Well, in this way, Boaz is providing for them within the legal means, but he's making sure it's done, but he's not bringing them any shame in doing it. And so we see this is verse 17. It says, so Ruth gathered grain in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gathered, and it was about 26 quarts of barley. She picked up the grain and went into the town. Where her mother-in-law saw that she had gleaned, she brought out what she had left over from her meal and gave it to her. So Ruth worked harvesting all day, and remember, her one chance in their welfare system is to pick up what the workers drop. Okay? If someone else beats her to it, she loses out. And her and Naomi go hungry. God's primary welfare system required work on their part, and it was very much a you snooze, you lose proposition. Okay, they're harvesting this field today. You better be behind them picking up what they drop, because by tomorrow it may be gone. But after working to harvest grain all day, probably as long as the harvesters were there working in the field, she then worked beating out the grain, getting the grain separated from the chaff, all the grain that she had gathered. Ruth was a hard worker. She was a dedicated person. And the benefit of all her hard work was 26 quarts of barley. Now, wouldn't you be excited about that? Okay, actually, 26 quarts of barley would probably be about 33 pounds, or about almost 2/3 of a bushel. This could be roasted. It could be boiled into a porridge. It could be added to stews, or it could be ground into flour. They had a lot of uses for barley. This one day's work would have provided enough food for Ruth and Naomi to last probably for about 10 days. 26 quarts of barley, that's probably enough for them to live on for 10 days. And if you're wondering, yes, they really would eat the same meal after meal, day after day, for weeks. Okay, we're very spoiled in our diet. Now, this is different in the modern world. We have the luxury of planning what we're going to eat. I mean, you probably go home today, you'll have a choice of, do I want this or do I want that? You have to pick which leftover am I eating today, that type of thing, or which place am I stopping to eat. But maybe you've heard this old English nursery rhyme. Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. What they're telling you in this nursery rhyme is they've been eating porridge made out of peas for 9 stinking days. That's the nursery rhyme. See, in England, peas were a common food staple. It was a major grain. In Asia, they eat rice, right? Every meal, every day, they eat a lot of rice. In our part of the world, we were much more likely to eat oatmeal. How many people eat oatmeal for breakfast still? Or grits. You got to have grits with your meal. If you're from the South. Or any other corn product. There was a day where people would eat cornmeal mush. Okay? In Israel, in this ancient time of the world, that area of the world, their common food was barley. And so they would often eat barley for every meal. Aren't you glad we have grocery stores? Doesn't it make life, it's just so much better. So Ruth carries her haul back to Naomi and gives her leftovers from lunch. And in this, Ruth shows her continual love and faithfulness for her mother-in-law. Ruth's the one who's been out there working all day, and yet she's taken home half her lunch to her mother-in-law because probably there's no food in the house. Naomi seems to see all this and recognize the haul that Ruth brought home was more than you would normally get from a day's welfare work. Okay, she's got a good amount of barley here and even brought home, half of her lunch. Naomi's been around the block, okay? She understands how things work. And she knows someone showed Ruth favor for her to come home with 26 quarts of barley. And so this is what we see next. In verse 19 says, her mother-in-law said to her, where did you gather barley today, and where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you. Ruth told her mother-in-law, whom she had worked with, and said, the name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may the Lord bless him, because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead. Naomi continued, the man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers. It just so happened that the man who took notice of Ruth, who showed kindness to her, was a close relative of Naomi. Ruth just happened into his field. No, I don't think so. I think it seems clear as we read through the story, and we'll see more, that this was a part of God's plan. We may sometimes look at our future and say, how are we going to survive? How are we going to make it through this? How are we going to get through this ordeal? But the truth is, God has a plan. In heaven, there are no worries. There is no panic. God has a plan. And if we do what is right, if we are faithful, we often walk right into his plan. Now, I do find it interesting that Naomi knew exactly who Boaz was, but she and Ruth didn't go to Boaz for help when they arrived in Bethlehem. They got in from Moab. They didn't go straight there. How many of us would be knocking on our relative's door? Hey, I just got into town, and you put me up for a night. Can I have dinner with you? Especially if we had a rich relative. Okay, Boaz is a rich relative. Hey, we'd be knocking on his door. But not Naomi and Ruth. They seem to be trying to make it on their own. Now, there could be a pride element involved here. You probably run into that with people who they don't want to take charity. So that could be it. But they're following the system of welfare that God prescribed. And in that process, God does provide for them abundantly. They did what God's word said, and they now have provision. This is probably a good lesson for us to take note of. When we are facing difficulties, maybe we ought to firstly do what God said, and second, maybe we should try working before we go looking for a handout. God expects us to work for our living. Okay, that is a biblical principle. He expects us to work. Now, the chapter concludes with this. It says, Ruth the Moabitess said, he also told me, stay with my young men until they have finished all my harvest. So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, Ruth, my daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants so that nothing will happen to you in another field." Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So Naomi instructs Ruth to follow Boaz's instructions and stay working with his harvesters, stay close to his female servants for her protection. I mean, if you're out in a field somewhere else, that's where bad things can happen to you if you're a young lady in those times. And so this is her protection. And Naomi says, no, this is the right plan. You stay with Boaz's people. You keep harvesting in his fields since he has invited you. This continues on through both the barley and the wheat harvests, which is really about a 3-month period. We're seeing the entire spring. The barley harvest started at Passover and ended at Pentecost. Okay, we see that in the biblical calendar. And then the wheat harvest begins at Pentecost and runs to the beginning of summer. So it's like the whole spring, kind of like mid-March through mid-June in our calendar is when she would have been out working every day, harvesting behind Boaz's workers. Assuming she did as well during the remainder of her harvest as she did the first day, she probably harvested enough grain to take care of her and Naomi for the whole season. It had worked. It had provided. God's system had provided for her and Naomi, providing their needs. This wouldn't have given them an elaborate diet. I mean, I'd like to know where to harvest pizzas, but, they didn't have that. But it probably would have given them enough to make their basic food needs, and they didn't have to only eat the grain they harvested. They could sell it or trade it for other food products. That was a common thing in the ancient world. I mean, you grow one thing, but you trade it with someone else. And so we see in Ruth an interesting look that we don't get anywhere else of how God's welfare system worked in action. It's a kind of a picture of how God's law worked in practical reality. And while our society does things differently, we still have an obligation to help those who are underprivileged. That didn't disappear. We have an obligation to help the poor, the resident alien, the orphan, and the widow. So how do we do that? Now, I know our taxes go to support certain welfare programs, but see, that doesn't alleviate our responsibility to those in need around us in our community. We are accountable to God regardless of what our society or the government does or does not do. And I think this is especially important for us as followers of Christ because we are His witnesses. What testimony am I giving by showing the compassion of Christ to those who are in need, to those who are defenseless? Now, certainly the biblical concept would be that we share our blessings with others. Do you have an abundance of food? Well, give some of it away to someone who doesn't. That's a biblical concept. I mean, you see someone's hungry, feed them. I think Jesus said something to that effect. Probably not too many of us, at least to the best of my knowledge, have standing fields of grain. I guess I haven't been in your backyards lately, but sometimes I've had weeds as tall as grain, but that's a different story. But we do, many of us have fruit trees. Don't let it go to waste. If you're not able to pick it, invite someone else. If you know someone's hungry, hey, would you like some fruit off my tree? Help yourself. That would be very fitting to what, God said. Helping others isn't always convenient. In fact, I have found we often take the easy way out. We will gladly support organizations that make it so we don't have to deal with the poor ourselves. Or as Ebenezer Scrooge said, I pay my taxes. Okay, that was his attitude, if you read A Christmas Carol. But sometimes we'll even support, hey, I like what the Salvation Army's doing, or I like what Goodwill's doing, I like that. And so we'll support that, but then we feel that we're free to not have to do anything ourselves. Or maybe it's easier just to give a small handout to get people to leave us alone. You've had people approach you in the parking lot, and it's easier to give them $2 than it is to deal with their problem. Sometimes we will pay them to go away. But maybe what we need to do is take the time to help them in a way that has a lasting and positive effect. It's more complicated. It's more difficult, but sometimes that's what we should do. Now, might I suggest that on some occasions, rather than just giving a handout, we should actually give people work. Somebody needs something, give them work. Help them find a job. That's not wrong to do. It takes more time. And maybe it's even you don't have the job or the ability to hire them yourself, but you're going to help them find somewhere that does. That takes time and commitment. It may not cost you money, but it'll take time and commitment. And I know it's a lot harder, but it seems it fits better with God's system. And it also sort of helps filter out who's really in need and who's abusing the system. Because I have seen people who say, well, I need this or I need that. And I say, well, I can give you this. Somebody says they're hungry. I'll say, here I have a granola bar. Oh, I can't eat that. Okay, well, I've got this. Oh, I can't eat that. My diet doesn't. Once you run through 2 or 3 things that they can't eat, well, how hungry are they? Somebody says, oh, I need a job and I'm trying to, hey, let me help you find a job. Oh, I can't do this kind of work. Oh, I can't do that. Well, doesn't take long to figure out who's serious. On the other hand, you might find someone who says, yes, I would gladly do this work. Yes, I will gladly eat that granola bar. You find out real quick when you genuinely offer something that will meet their need and you're willing to take the time to meet the need. It kind of sorts things out. I find it interesting, God's welfare system was hard to abuse because it was limited. You had to be there at harvest time, show up at the right time, and you had to work to get it. Okay, yes, it was provided. The grain is there, but if you wanted it, you had to go collect it. James says this is James chapter 1, verse 27. He says, pure and undefiled religion before God, the Father, is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. I see that in Boaz. Here's Ruth and Naomi in their moment of distress. As far as we can tell, they don't even have dinner. And Boaz steps in and helps. Boaz makes sure, through the system God had given, but he makes sure they have their need met. He looked after widows in their distress. But James is telling us God expects the same from us. He expects the same from us. And so this week, I'd like to challenge you to live your faith by helping someone who's genuinely in need. Maybe there's a widow, an orphan, someone in a nursing home, someone who is genuinely in need, and maybe it's your neighbor. But try to do something without shaming them, without anything that might tarnish their reputation. I'm not saying just give a handout, but instead look for ways to offer them a hand up so that they can be blessed and so that you can be a testimony to Christ in their life. Not just a passing, here's a buck, but someone who really does something so you can share Jesus.